Chosen one, hear this clearly. Heaven has just shattered the siege that surrounded your life. What once felt like constant pressure, unrelenting opposition, and invisible resistance has been broken in the spirit realm. The darkness that tried to suffocate your light, drain your strength, and convince you that this season would never end has reached its limit. It didn't stop because it suddenly became weak. It stopped because your light refused to go out. Even now, as these words reach you, something has shifted. The standoff that drained you, the warfare that exhausted you, the tension that lingered day after day, it has ended. What was prolonged is now finished. What was contested is now conquered. What was questioned is now confirmed. This message is not accidental. The timing is intentional. You are hearing this now because your endurance carried you to the breaking point of the battle. The reason the attack was so relentless, the reason the pressure intensified instead of easing, is because the enemy recognized what you carry. Darkness does not waste effort on what poses no threat. It does not surround what it can ignore. The very fact that the warfare persisted was proof that your light mattered, that your presence disrupted something that had been operating unchecked for far too long. And instead of dimming, instead of retreating, instead of compromising to survive, you stayed lit. You kept showing up. You kept standing. You kept shining even when it felt costly. Not because you were weak, but because you were human. This is where the standoff began. On one side was darkness, applying consistent pressure, hoping time would do what force could not. On the other side was you, standing, sometimes trembling, sometimes weary, sometimes confused, but still standing. The battlefield was not just your circumstances. It was your resolve. Every day you chose to keep believing, keep obeying, keep shining. You were silently draining the enemy's resources. Every moment you refused to compromise, you were shortening the lifespan of his strategy. Even when it felt like nothing was changing, something was shifting underneath the surface. The enemy understood something you may not have fully realized at the time. If he could get you to dim voluntarily, he wouldn't have to fight you at all. If he could convince you to shrink your obedience, soften your convictions, lower your expectations, or numb your passion, the siege would end on his terms. That is why the pressure targeted your endurance more than your belief. That is why the attacks often came when you were already tired. That is why the whispers sounded like, "Is it really worth it? Why keep trying?" No one sees this anyway. These were not random thoughts. They were invitations to self-dimming. But here is what heaven revealed in this season. You did not accept the invitation. You didn't quit when it would have been understandable. You didn't compromise when it would have been convenient. You didn't extinguish your light just to make the battle stop. You stayed present. You stayed faithful. You stayed obedient, even when obedience felt costly and unseen. And that choice, repeated day after day, became the very thing the enemy could not overcome. This is where spiritual warfare must be understood correctly. The struggle was never against people, personalities, or visible circumstances. It was against systems of darkness that recognized your assignment long before you did. You were not just defending your peace, your joy, or your personal breakthrough. You were defending your calling. The light you carry is not passive. It exposes lies that have gone unchallenged. It threatens structures built on compromise. It disrupts agreements that have operated quietly for generations. And when light enters spaces like that, darkness doesn't negotiate, it resists. That resistance followed you because your presence alone was enough to shift atmospheres. Your obedience challenged norms. Your integrity exposed shortcuts. Your consistency threatened cycles that relied on apathy and silence to survive. Even when you weren't trying to confront anything, just by being who God called you to be, you were shining light into places that preferred shadow. That is why the enemy refused to retreat. He wasn't just fighting you. He was fighting the consequences of what your continued obedience would eventually produce. And yet, what darkness underestimated was your willingness to endure. You kept worshiping when worship felt empty. You kept praying when answers felt delayed. You kept declaring truth when emotions argued otherwise. You kept standing when standing felt impossible. Each of those moments mattered more than you realized at the time. Every refusal to dim was not just an act of faith, it was an act of warfare. You were not merely surviving the pressure, you were slowly exhausting the opposition. There comes a moment in every prolonged battle when one side runs out of capacity to continue. That moment has arrived. The standoff broke not because darkness decided to be merciful, but because it could no longer sustain the fight. Your consistency exposed the limits of its endurance. Your light proved stronger than its resistance. What once felt endless has reached its conclusion, not because the storm was imaginary, but because the foundation beneath your light was stronger than the storm above it. Now you can see why the attack was relentless. It wasn't random. It wasn't excessive. It was strategic. And now you can see why it ended suddenly. Strategies fail when the opponent refuses to cooperate. Darkness counted on you burning out, and you didn't. It counted on you growing bitter, and you didn't. It counted on you compromising to escape the pressure, and you refused. That refusal changed everything. As you step into what comes next, you must carry this understanding with you. Do not reinterpret the past season as failure or delay. It was proof of danger to the kingdom of darkness. The warfare validated the value of what you carry. The endurance refined the authority you are about to walk in. And the victory you are stepping into now was forged in moments when no one was applauding, no one was affirming, and no one but God saw the cost of your obedience. This is why the siege had to end the way it did. Not quietly, not gradually, but decisively. Darkness does not retreat gracefully when it has invested this much. It collapses when it runs out of strength. And that is exactly what happened. Your light outlasted the darkness. And now, with the standoff broken, the same light that was once under pressure is about to operate with freedom, authority, and clarity you have never known before. This is not the end of the story. It is the turning point. As the pressure lifts and clarity begins to settle, it becomes essential to understand what the battle was really circling around, because it was never just about endurance. It was about identity. The reason the siege could not succeed is because the light you carry is not something you turn on and off depending on the season. It is not an accessory you wear when conditions are favorable. It is not a personality trait, a talent, or a mood. It is assignment. And once that truth takes root, everything about the last season and the next one starts to make sense. From a moment you were born again, something irreversible happened in the spirit. Light was not merely added to your life. It became woven into who you are. Jesus did not say you might become the light if you tried hard enough or believed strongly enough. He said you are the light of the world. Present tense. Permanent. Non négociable. That means the enemy was never fighting to take your light away, because he can't. He was fighting to convince you to hide it, suppress it, or treat it as optional. Because while darkness cannot remove light, it can sometimes persuade people to put it under a bowl. That is why the resistance followed you into spaces where you thought you were simply being faithful. Your obedience was never neutral. Your presence was never passive. Light, by its very nature, confronts whatever it encounters. It reveals truth without asking permission. It exposes reality without needing volume. And that is precisely why your life has felt like a disruption to environments that preferred comfort over conviction. You were not imagining the tension. You were not too much. You were not misreading the room. Your light was doing exactly what it was designed to do. This is where many believers misunderstand their calling. They assume light is meant primarily for encouragement, warmth, and reassurance. And while it does provide those things, its first function is exposure. Light reveals what is actually there. It makes hidden things visible. It removes the ability for lies to masquerade as truth. And when light enters spaces that have grown accustomed to shadow, it creates discomfort before it produces freedom. That discomfort is not a sign that light is wrong. It is proof that something was hiding. So when opposition rose around you, it wasn't because you were attacking anyone. It was because your light was illuminating realities that could no longer remain concealed. Systems built on compromise don't collapse quietly. Patterns rooted in deception don't dissolve peacefully. Strongholds don't surrender voluntarily. They resist exposure. And because your light is assignment-driven, not mood-driven, it kept shining even when you were tired, unsure, or misunderstood. Picture a lighthouse standing on a cliff during a violent storm. The waves do not crash against it because the lighthouse is aggressive. They crash against it because it is immovable. The storm does not rage because the light is offensive. It rages because the light refuses to go out. That lighthouse does not argue with the storm. It does not chase the waves. It does not adjust its position to accommodate the weather. It simply remains anchored and continues shining. That is what your life has looked like. The storm was real. The pressure was relentless. But your light stayed anchored to the one who placed it there. This is why the attempt to make you dim was so subtle at times. It wasn't always about blatant sin or obvious rebellion. Often, it came in the form of reasonable suggestions. Just rest a little longer. Pull back for your own peace. You don't have to be so intense. Not everything needs your obedience. These weren't invitations to darkness. They were invitations to neutrality. And neutrality is the one thing light cannot be. Light either shines or it doesn't. The moment you decide to make it optional, you place it under a bowl. But you didn't, even when you questioned yourself, even when you wondered if the cost was too high, even when you felt isolated in your obedience. Something in your spirit refused to go dark. That refusal mattered more than you knew. Because light that continues shining under pressure does not just illuminate. It establishes authority. And authority changes atmospheres. This is why you must stop interpreting your past season as merely survival. You are not just making it through. You are being positioned. Every moment you stayed lit when it would have been easier to fade built credibility in the spirit realm. Darkness learned that you could not be intimidated out of your identity. Heaven witnessed your consistency and entrusted you with greater weight. The assignment attached to your light was being confirmed through endurance. There is also something important you need to grasp about light. It is not self-serving. It exists for the benefit of others. A lamp is not lit for its own enjoyment. A city on a hill is not elevated for its own visibility. Light shines so others can see clearly, move safely, and find their way. That means the resistance you faced was not only about you. It was about who would be impacted if you kept shining. The enemy wasn't just afraid of your obedience. He was afraid of the chain reaction it would produce. Your light threatens generational patterns. It interrupts cycles that have gone unquestioned. It challenges agreements people didn't even realize they made. When you walk into a room, things become visible that people have learned to ignore. When you stay obedient in a season where compromise is normalized, it exposes alternatives others didn't think were possible. That kind of light doesn't just change individuals. It shifts cultures. And that is why the battle was so determined. Yet, what the enemy did not account for was this. Your light is anchored to something stronger than circumstance. It is not fueled by applause. It is not sustained by ease. It is powered by God Himself. That means storms can rage, waves can crash, and winds can howl, but the source remains untouched. The pressure tested the structure, not the source, and the structure held. Now, as the storm begins to break, you're being invited to consciously agree with what has always been true about you. This is not a season to shrink, hide, or downplay what you carry. It is a season to stand fully in your identity without apology. To declare, not quietly, not timidly, but firmly, that your light is not optional, not negotiable, and not up for debate. You are not designed to blend in. You are designed to illuminate. Say it until it settles in your spirit. You are the light of the world. Not because you earned it, but because it was assigned to you. Not because you feel strong, but because the source within you is unchanging. And that light is not for your comfort alone. It is for exposure, transformation, and freedom. As this truth anchors itself within you, something shifts internally. Endurance takes on new meaning. Obedience feels less like obligation and more like alignment. You stop asking whether shining is worth the cost, because you realize dimming would cost you far more. You begin to understand that every space you are called into will not always welcome light, but it will always need it. And here is the quiet confidence that begins to rise when identity is settled. You no longer fear resistance, because you recognize it as confirmation. You no longer interpret pressure as punishment, because you understand it as proximity to purpose. You no longer question whether you belong in certain rooms, because your light answers that question before your words ever do. This is why the siege had to fail. It was fighting something it could not redefine. It was pushing against an identity that could not be rewritten. And now that the pressure has lifted, you're not stepping back into who you were before the battle. You are stepping forward as someone who knows exactly who they are. Your light is assignment. And now that the assignment is moving into a new phase, the light will shine with greater clarity, greater authority, and greater impact than ever before. As your identity settles and the truth of what you carry becomes clear, the next layer of understanding begins to unfold, because knowing who you are inevitably leads to understanding how you endured. What sustained you is not passive patience or empty waiting. It was something far more powerful. Endurance itself became a form of warfare, and every day you stayed standing, something unseen was being built inside you. Many people misunderstand endurance because they associate it with silence, stagnation, or simply getting through. But biblical endurance is never passive. It is active resistance against surrender. It is the daily decision to remain aligned when circumstances argue otherwise. It is the choice to continue showing up, believing, obeying, and shining even when nothing externally affirms that choice. And when endurance is practiced consistently over time, it transforms into authority. This is where the battle quietly shifted in your favor. At first, it looked like darkness had the advantage. The pressure was constant. The relief was delayed. The answers felt distant. But while the enemy was focused on exhausting you, heaven was strengthening you. Every moment you refused to quit added weight to your spirit. Every time you stood when it would have been understandable to sit down, your inner foundation deepened. Endurance was not just keeping you alive, it was training you. Scripture is clear about this pattern, even though it is often overlooked. Trials come first. Perseverance follows. Character is formed, and reward is released. There is a divine order to growth, and it rarely begins with visibility. It begins with testing, not to see if you will fail, but to reveal what you are becoming. You are not being punished by the pressure. You are being prepared by it. Think about how authority is developed in the natural world. No one is trusted with responsibility they have not proven they can carry. No one is handed influence without first demonstrating faithfulness. The same principle applies spiritually. Authority is not assigned based on desire. It is established through endurance. Darkness recognizes this, which is why it tries to interrupt the process before it completes. But the process completed anyway, because you stayed. Every time the enemy attacked, and you didn't retreat, something shifted in the unseen realm. Every time he pressed, and you didn't collapse, your endurance deepened. Every time he whispered that it wasn't worth it, and you kept going anyway, you gained spiritual muscle that cannot be fabricated or rushed. That kind of strength can only be built through sustained resistance. It cannot be downloaded. It must be lived. This is why the standoff was not wasted time. It was a training ground. It was the place where shallow faith was replaced with resilient trust, where borrowed confidence was exchanged for settled conviction, where your faith moved from theory to embodiment. You didn't just learn about perseverance. You became perseverant. And once endurance becomes part of who you are, it can never be taken from you. There's a reason Scripture promises a crown to those who persevere. That crown is not symbolic decoration. It represents authority, legitimacy, and the right to operate at levels that casual faith cannot access. Crowns are worn by those who have proven they can carry weight. And what you endured qualified you for something greater than what you were originally praying for. During the standoff, it may have felt like nothing was changing. Days blended together. Progress felt slow. Breakthrough seemed distant. But endurance works quietly. It strengthens roots before it produces fruit. And while you were waiting for circumstances to shift, your capacity was expanding. Your discernment sharpened. Your resilience increased. Your dependence on God deepened. You were becoming someone who could sustain the very breakthrough you were asking for. This is where many people falter. They desire the outcome, but resist the formation. They want the victory without the endurance that gives it meaning. But heaven is intentional. What God releases must be sustained by the person receiving it. And sustainability requires strength. The endurance you developed ensured that when the siege ended, you would not collapse under the weight of what comes next. Consider the image of a blacksmith shaping metal. The fire is not meant to destroy the metal. It is meant to make it malleable. The hammer is not striking randomly. It is shaping intentionally. Each blow is purposeful. Each moment in the heat serves a function. When the process is complete, the metal is not weaker. It is stronger, sharper, and ready for use. The standoff did the same thing to you. It did not diminish you. It refined you. What once felt like delay was actually alignment. What felt like pressure was actually preparation. And what felt like being stuck was actually being strengthened in ways you could not have accessed any other way. The endurance you built will now carry you through future seasons with greater confidence and less fear. Battles that once felt overwhelming will no longer intimidate you the same way. Not because they won't be real, but because you now know what you are capable of surviving. This is why you must change the way you speak about the season you just exited. Do not call it wasted time. Do not refer to it as loss. Do not diminish its significance. That season shaped you. It trained you. It taught you how to stand when standing cost you something. And the lessons you learned there will become the foundation for everything that follows. Endurance also taught you discernment. You learned which voices mattered and which ones didn't. You learned the difference between urgency and obedience. You learned how to hear God in the quiet when noise was constant. You learned how to stay grounded when emotions fluctuated. These are not small skills. They're essential for the level of influence you're stepping into. And perhaps most importantly, endurance taught you that your strength does not come from your circumstances improving. It comes from your alignment remaining intact. You discovered that joy is not dependent on ease, that peace is not dependent on control, and that confidence is not dependent on approval. Those revelations cannot be taken from you. They are now part of your spiritual DNA. This is why the enemy could no longer maintain the standoff. Endurance exposes limitations. Darkness has a threshold. It can only apply pressure for so long before it exhausts itself. Light, however, draws from an eternal source. The longer the standoff lasted, the more the imbalance became obvious. You were being strengthened while the strategy against you was being depleted. Eventually, the equation shifted. What once felt like an even fight became unsustainable for the enemy. Not because you suddenly became aggressive, but because you became unmovable. Endurance created stability. Stability produced authority. Authority broke the siege. Now, as you stand on the other side of this season, you are not the same person who entered it. You carry a different weight. You operate with a different clarity. You trust differently. You stand differently. And this difference will be felt everywhere you go. People may not be able to articulate what changed, but they will sense it. Your presence will feel grounded. Your words will carry conviction. Your obedience will have impact. This is what endurance does when it completes its work. It transforms survival into strength. It turns waiting into wisdom. It converts pressure into power. And now that the process has reached its conclusion, the endurance that once kept you standing will now propel you forward. The standoff did not delay your calling. It prepared you for it. The resistance did not weaken your light. It weaponized it. And the endurance you built will now operate as quiet authority, unshakable, undeniable, and deeply rooted. You did not just make it through. You were forged. And what was forged in you cannot be undone. As everything you have just walked through begins to settle in your spirit, the conclusion does not arrive as an ending, but as a commissioning. What you endured was never meant to close you in. It was meant to carry you forward. The siege is over, not because the calling has lessened, but because the preparation is complete. You are not stepping back into life as it was before the battle. You are stepping forward as someone who knows who they are, understands what they carry, and trusts the process that shaped them. What once felt like resistance now reads as confirmation. What once felt like delay now reveals itself as divine timing. You can finally see that nothing was wasted. Not the long nights, not the unanswered questions, not the moments where faith felt heavier than hope. Every step was building something within you that ease never could. And now, the same light that was tested in private will begin to shine with clarity in public, not for your glory, but for impact. This is where wisdom must anchor you. Increased radiance requires intentional stewardship. Authority must be carried with humility. Visibility must be matched with integrity. The strength you now possess is not meant to harden you, but to ground you. The clarity you walk in is not meant to isolate you, but to guide others. And the light you carry is not meant to be flaunted, but faithfully released wherever God positions you. Remember this as you move forward. Darkness does not get the final word over your life. It never did. It was allowed to test, but not to define. You are defined by the one who placed the light within you and sustained it when everything else shook. The standoff is over because it accomplished its purpose. You endured. You remained. You became. Now go forward without shrinking, without apologizing, without second-guessing what God has clearly established. Let your life preach without striving. Let your obedience speak louder than explanation. Let your light shine, not anxiously, not aggressively, but confidently, knowing it is anchored in something eternal. This is not just a season of recovery. It is a season of release. Walk in it with courage. Stand in it with humility. Shine in it with consistency. And never forget, what outlasted the darkness will continue to illuminate the path ahead. What you are about to hear will bring clarity to the season you just survived. It will explain why the enemy refused to retreat, why the battle felt unfair, and why your quiet refusal to quit became the weapon that ended the war. This wasn't just about you holding on. It was about your light outlasting the darkness that tried to outweigh you. The victory didn't come because the enemy suddenly changed his mind. It came because he ran out of strength fighting someone who would not stop shining. Stay with this word until the very end, because we will pray together and seal what heaven is releasing. If you feel something stirring in your spirit right now, if you sense weight lifting, clarity forming, or faith rising, that is not emotion. That is alignment. As an act of agreement, type light in the comments. Let it be your declaration that you are still standing, still shining, and stepping into what God has finished. You were never meant to walk this path alone. You are part of a company of chosen ones whose light is rising together. And what God is doing now is only the beginning. What you must understand now, especially after what you have survived, is that the intensity of the battle was never meant to signal your defeat. It was meant to reveal your significance. There is a truth most believers are never taught, and because they never learn it, they misinterpret resistance as rejection and pressure as punishment. But the reality is this: darkness does not attack what it can ignore. It does not invest energy, strategy, or persistence into lives that pose no threat. It does not lay siege to people who are content to stay hidden, quiet, or comfortable. The very fact that the warfare surrounding your life escalated instead of fading was not proof that you were losing ground. It was evidence that you were advancing into territory the enemy could not afford to lose. Think about that for a moment. If your life were insignificant, the resistance would have been minimal. If your obedience carried no weight, the opposition would have been brief. If your light were weak or inconsequential, darkness would have passed you by and focused elsewhere. But it didn't. It lingered. It circled. It pressed. It returned again and again, not with random chaos, but with calculated persistence. That alone should tell you something. You were never just fighting to survive. You were standing in the way of something much larger than yourself. This is where many people become confused. They assume that faithfulness should lead to ease, that obedience should result in immediate relief, and that prayer should always shorten the battle. So when the opposite happens, when prayer seems to intensify resistance, when fasting doesn't stop the pressure, when declarations don't immediately silence the storm, they begin to question themselves. They wonder if they're doing something wrong, if their faith is deficient, if God has withdrawn his covering. But what if the continued resistance was not heaven's absence, but hell's alarm? What if the pressure didn't mean God stepped back, but that the enemy leaned in because time was running out? Scripture tells us plainly that our adversary does not operate impulsively. He prowls. He observes. He studies patterns, weaknesses, endurance levels. A prowling predator is not looking for the strongest prey. It is watching for the one that will eventually grow tired, distracted, or discouraged enough to stop fighting. That is what you were up against. The enemy was not trying to destroy you instantly, because instant destruction was not his most effective strategy. He was trying to outlast you. He was betting that if the pressure stayed long enough, if the weight remained heavy enough, if the resistance became exhausting enough, you would eventually choose relief over radiance.